There were 250,000 children who simply vanished from the official record, and almost nobody noticed. Not missing, not dead, just quietly moved, renamed, and handed to strangers. And the people who did this called it charity. I want to tell you about a man named Daniel. He was a historical researcher, the kind of guy who spent more time in archive basements than in daylight. Dusty shelves, flickering fluorescent lights, the smell of paper so old it felt like breathing in someone else's past. That was his world. He was comfortable there. He liked the quiet. He liked the certainty of documents, the feeling that whatever happened in the past was fixed and findable, that you just had to look long enough. He stopped feeling that way on a Tuesday afternoon when he pulled a sealed wooden box from a shelf in a regional archive and found something inside that genuinely scared him. The box had no label, just a small strip of adhesive tape across the lid with two initials written in pencil and a filing code that led nowhere in the archives system. The kind of thing that gets ignored for decades because nobody knows what category it belongs to. Daniel almost put it back. He didn't, and that decision is the reason we're here. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, handwritten on thin paper that had gone soft at the folds. Letters written by elderly people, some barely legible, some surprisingly sharp and clear. And they all described the same thing in different words. Towns that felt like costumes. That was the phrase one woman used, and it stopped Daniel cold the first time he read it. Towns that felt like costumes. She described arriving as a young girl to a small settlement and immediately sensing that something was wrong. Not dangerous, not frightening, just wrong. Like the buildings were older than the people who claimed to have built them. Like the streets had been walked by someone else for a long time before she got there. Daniel read letter after letter and felt the hairs on his arms stand up, not because the writing was dramatic. These were quiet, careful people. People who had clearly thought a long time before writing any of this down, but because the details kept matching. Different writers, different towns, different decades, and the same detail kept appearing. Workers covering dates on building facades. Cornerstones with something underneath the fresh plaster, numbers that didn't match. He cross-referenced the letter writers. Every single one of them had been a ward child. A child relocated through a government-sponsored resettlement program that ran for the better part of a century. Children taken from crowded cities and placed with rural families under the banner of welfare and compassion. Daniel sat in that archive basement for a long time after he figured that out. The fluorescent light buzzed above him. The box sat open on the table. He looked at those letters and understood, in the way you understand something before you can fully explain it, that someone had sealed this box very deliberately, and that the person who did it had made a choice not to destroy it. That choice is the only reason this story exists. If any of what I'm about to tell you matters to you even a little, please take 2 seconds right now and subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this kind of story reach more people, and trust me, more people need to hear this, now. Let me tell you about the program itself, because before you understand what it was hiding, you need to understand how perfectly it was designed to hide it. The Children's Welfare Transit Initiative, as it was formerly known in its early years, was the brainchild of a man named Harold Prentice, a civic reformer, well-connected, well-funded, the kind of man who gave speeches about moral duty and received standing ovations for them. His public argument was straightforward. Port cities were overwhelmed with children living on the streets. Rural communities needed labor and were willing to provide homes. Move the children west and everyone benefits. Simple, clean, charitable. The problem was the mechanics. And Daniel noticed the mechanics immediately because he had spent years reading institutional documents and he knew what a real welfare program looked like. It had paperwork, it had verification, it had some system, however imperfect, for tracking outcomes and following up. The Transit Initiative had none of that. Children were gathered from city streets and temporary shelters, loaded onto trains, and at each stop they were brought to a public hall or a church and made to stand in front of waiting families. Families who walked among them, looked them over, and pointed to the ones they wanted. No background checks on the families, no legal adoption proceedings, no central registry of placements. Once a child left on a wagon with a family, there was no mechanism anywhere in the system to find out what happened to that child next. For a charity program, that is a catastrophic design failure. You do not build a system that moves tens of thousands of children across a continent and includes zero accountability by accident. That kind of omission requires effort. It requires someone, at some point in the design process, to look at the question of how we track these children and decide the answer is, we don't. Daniel pulled the funding records for the initiative, or tried to. The public-facing donors were exactly who you would expect: church organizations, civic associations, a handful of wealthy families with philanthropic reputations. But beneath that layer, the financial trail went deliberately soft. Contributions recorded in round numbers with no originating institution named. Operational costs covered by transfers from accounts that no longer existed. The money was there. The source was not. Daniel leaned back in his chair and thought about what kind of organization needs to move that many people, with that much funding, and leave that few records. He thought about the letters in the box on the table behind him. He thought about towns that felt like costumes. And then he started pulling fire records. Every single town that received the highest concentration of relocated children had burned. Not some of them, not most of them, everyone. Daniel discovered this at around 2 in the morning, sitting at his kitchen table with printed spreadsheets spread across every surface and a cold cup of coffee he had forgotten about an hour earlier. He had started with the drop-off records he managed to piece together from the Transit Initiative's incomplete files, the towns that appeared most frequently as destinations for the relocated children. Then he pulled regional fire records for those same towns and laid them side by side. He expected maybe a loose connection, something worth investigating further. What he got felt like a punch to the chest. The overlap was not partial, it was not suggestive, it was total. Every major receiving town in his dataset had experienced a significant fire in the decades before the children arrived. And not small fires, not a building here or there. Fires that consumed entire central districts. Fires that gutted the downtown core and left grand structures as hollow shells. And then, within a generation, children arrived. Quietly, steadily, in groups small enough not to attract attention. And those towns filled back up. Daniel started mapping it visually, pinning locations on a large sheet of paper he taped to his kitchen wall. He used red dots for fires and blue dots for high-volume child placements. By 3 in the morning, the wall looked like a pattern a person could read from across the room. Red, then blue. Red, then blue. Over and over, across dozens of locations, spanning several decades. He stood back and looked at it for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed slowly on the wet street. He thought about Harold Prentice giving his charitable speeches to standing ovations, and he felt something cold settle in his stomach. But the map was only the beginning of what bothered him. Because when Daniel started reading the actual fire reports, the official accounts of what happened in these towns, he ran into something he did not expect. The explanations were strange, not in an obvious way, not in a way that screamed cover-up, in a quieter, more unsettling way. The language was vague where it should have been specific, causes listed as undetermined or attributed to circumstances that made no physical sense when you thought about them carefully. One report described a fire that consumed a row of stone municipal buildings and attributed it to heat traveling from a wooden structure on the opposite side of a wide cobblestone road. Stone does not ignite from radiant heat at that distance. Any engineer will tell you that, but the report stated it plainly, as if it were obvious, and nobody in the official record appears to have questioned it. Another report described a fire that started in 3 separate locations within the same city block within minutes of each other. The official conclusion was that sparks from the first ignition point traveled to the other 2. Daniel measured the distances on an old town map. The 3 points formed a triangle with sides long enough that the spark explanation required wind conditions that the same report described as calm that evening. He found 7 reports with similar internal contradictions. Not dramatic inconsistencies, the kind that get noticed. Small ones. The kind that only surface when you read slowly, when you care enough to check the details against each other. The kind that suggests the reports were written by people who needed an explanation on record, not people who needed an accurate one. And then there was the burn pattern itself. Daniel found post-fire photographs in several archive collections, grainy images printed on heavy stock that smelled faintly of chemicals, even after all these years. He spread them out under his desk lamp and looked at them carefully. What he saw did not match the official narratives. The grand structures, the civic buildings, the large halls with ornate stonework, were consistently the most devastated. Gutted, collapsed, reduced to elaborate rubble. But smaller wooden structures on the periphery, the kind of building that should ignite and spread flame faster than anything else, were frequently intact, scorched sometimes, damaged occasionally, but standing. Fire does not behave that way on its own. Fire follows fuel and oxygen. It does not selectively consume the heaviest, most fire-resistant structures while leaving lighter ones nearby untouched. Daniel was not a fire investigator, but he knew enough basic physics to understand that what he was looking at in those photographs required an explanation that none of the official reports came close to providing. He wrote one word in his notebook and underlined it twice: selective. And that word led him somewhere he had not anticipated going, somewhere that made the map on his kitchen wall feel like the least disturbing thing he had found so far. Because if the fires were selective, someone had to be doing the selecting. And if someone was doing the selecting, then what came after the fires, the children, the resettlement, the quiet repopulation of gutted towns, was not a response to a tragedy. It was the second half of a plan. Daniel looked at the photographs again in the yellow light of his desk lamp, and for the first time since opening that sealed box, he felt genuinely afraid. But fear did not stop him. It never does when you have already seen too much to walk away. He turned to the photographs of the buildings themselves, the ones that supposedly burned and were supposedly rebuilt, and what he found in those images broke the timeline of official history completely open. There were no construction photographs. That detail sounds small. It is not small. By the time these towns were supposedly erecting their grand civic halls and ornate public buildings, photography was not new. Photographers documented bridges, railways, ordinary street scenes, family portraits, market days. They documented everything. But for the construction of these large, complex, architecturally elaborate structures, the ones that should have taken years to build and employed hundreds of workers, there was nothing. No foundations being laid, no walls going up, no scaffolding, no workers, only finished buildings, and then their ruins. Daniel pulled every archive collection he could access that covered these towns during the supposed construction periods. Regional newspapers, civic society records, private photograph albums donated by local families over the years. He was looking for any image, any passing mention, any casual reference to the work in progress. The kind of thing that shows up naturally in the background of daily life when a massive building project is happening nearby. He found almost nothing. A few written references to construction in progress, brief lines in local papers, the kind of item that gets 3 sentences and no follow-up. But images, physical evidence of buildings in the process of being made, absent. One structural engineer Daniel eventually contacted, a cautious man who agreed to look at a selection of the photographs only on the condition that his name not appear anywhere, studied the images for several days before responding. His written reply was short. He said that the weathering visible on the stonework in the post-fire ruins was inconsistent with the age the buildings were claimed to be. He said the foundation construction visible in collapsed sections used techniques and materials that did not match what was available in the period when these buildings were supposedly erected. And he said one more thing, the thing Daniel kept coming back to in the weeks that followed. He said the ruins looked older than the fire. The empire that explained everything had been erased from every map on Earth within the span of a single human lifetime, and almost nobody alive today knows it ever existed. Daniel found it by accident. He was not looking for lost civilizations. He was looking for a way to explain the architecture, the buildings that were too old for their official ages, the ruins that predated the fires that supposedly created them. He had pulled a collection of old cartographic documents from a university library. Thick-bound atlases with cracked spines and pages that felt like dry skin under his fingers. He was looking for town layouts, old street grids, anything that might show what these settlements looked like before the fires. What he found instead stopped him completely. On the pages of an early 19th century atlas, printed by one of the most respected geographical societies of its time, was a territory labeled with absolute confidence, not a vague region, not a marginal note. A named, bordered, documented territory occupying an enormous portion of the known world, stretching from the edges of Eastern Europe across the entire breadth of the Asian continent to the Pacific coast. It had subdivisions. It had labeled cities. It had trade route markings. It was documented with the same cartographic precision and institutional authority as France, as Spain, as any territory any educated person of that era would have recognized without question. Daniel sat with that page for a long time. He had studied history. He had spent years in archives. He had never seen this territory given serious attention in any mainstream historical text. It appeared in old maps the way a word appears in a language that has since died, present in the record, absent from living memory. He pulled more atlases, earlier ones, later ones, editions spanning roughly 60 years. And he watched something happen across those pages that made his hands feel unsteady. In the early editions, the territory was there, clearly labeled, consistently bordered, updated between editions with the kind of small cartographic revisions that indicate active geographic knowledge. Then, starting around the mid-19th century, the updates stopped. The territory began to fragment across successive editions, its interior divisions multiplying, its outer borders softening. And then, over the course of perhaps 2 or 3 atlas editions, the name disappeared entirely. The land was still there. The geography had not changed, but the territory had been replaced by a collection of smaller, separately named regions, each with its own implied history, none of which acknowledged what the earlier maps had shown so plainly. Daniel lined up 4 atlas pages on his kitchen table and photographed them side by side. The progression was visible enough that you did not need to be a historian to understand what you were looking at. Something had been on the map, then it was gone. And the process of its disappearance was gradual enough to look like natural cartographic revision if you only looked at 2 editions at a time, but obvious and deliberate when you saw all 4 together. He thought about the fire reports with their careful internal contradictions. He thought about the funding records that went soft at a certain depth. He was beginning to recognize the signature of a particular kind of effort, not the crude effort of people who destroy evidence in a panic, the patient effort of people who understand that the most durable erasure is one that looks, at every individual step, like something ordinary. The territory's disappearance from the maps and the beginning of the fires overlapped almost exactly in time. Daniel stared at that fact for a long while. He was not ready to say out loud what it suggested, but he wrote it in his notebook, quietly, the way you write something you are not yet sure you believe but cannot stop thinking about. And then he asked a question that shifted everything. If this territory existed, if it was documented by credible institutions, if it had cities and trade routes and enough organizational complexity to appear on official maps for decades, then what did it build? And where did those buildings go? The answer was already on his kitchen wall. Red dots, blue dots, the grand structures with weathered stone and mismatched timelines, the ruins that looked older than the fires, the towns that felt like costumes, the buildings with no construction record. He had been looking at the remnants of that territory for weeks without knowing what he was looking at. And now that he did know, or at least suspected, the architecture looked completely different to him. Not impossible frontier construction, not miraculous pioneer achievement, something inherited, something that was already standing when the new story began. That realization made the next step feel almost inevitable, even though it was the step Daniel had been quietly dreading since the night he first opened the sealed box. He went back to the buildings. Not the ruins this time, the survivors. The grand civic structures that made it through the fires, or that appeared shortly afterward, fully formed, with no credible construction record to explain them. He had a collection of photographs now, sourced from 6 different archives, showing these buildings at various points in their documented histories. He laid them out by location and looked at them the way you look at a face you almost recognize. The architectural language was consistent in a way that should not have been possible across separate towns, separate regions, separate supposed construction periods. The same proportions, the same relationship between load-bearing elements and decorative ones. The same approach to underground infrastructure, because several of these buildings had documented basement and tunnel systems, whose construction alone would have represented a significant engineering undertaking. The same style, repeated across hundreds of miles and decades of official history, in towns that were supposedly built independently by different people with different resources at different times. Daniel had spoken to the engineer who said the ruins looked older than the fire. Now he contacted 2 more through careful, indirect channels, sharing only photographs and asking only technical questions. He did not tell them what he was looking for. He did not want to influence their reading of the images. The first one came back within a week. She focused on the underground structures visible in photographs of buildings that had partially collapsed during the fires, exposing their foundations. She said the construction method she was seeing in those exposed sections was not consistent with the period these buildings were claimed to have been built. She said she was looking at load distribution techniques that her training associated with much older construction traditions. She used a word that stayed with Daniel. She called it pre-industrial, confident, unhurried, built by people who expected it to last a very long time. The second engineer took longer and said less, but what he said was more specific. He pointed to a single detail visible in 3 separate photographs from 3 separate locations. A particular way of cutting and fitting stone at structural corners that appeared identically in all 3 images. Identically. Same angle, same technique. Same result. He said that kind of consistency across separate construction projects in separate places suggested either a single builder or a single tradition of building, not the work of independent frontier communities constructing their own civic halls from available materials and local knowledge. A single tradition. Daniel wrote that down and sat with it, because a single tradition implied a single origin, and the origin that fit everything he had found so far was sitting right there on those atlas pages, documented and labeled and then quietly, methodically erased from the record, while the buildings it left behind were given new names and new histories and new populations with no memory of what any of it used to be. The children in the letters had arrived in towns built by people nobody was allowed to remember. And somewhere in the decades between the territory's disappearance and Daniel's kitchen table, someone had worked very hard to make sure those 2 facts never appeared in the same sentence. One of the women who wrote those letters had kept a newspaper that proved the official timeline was a lie, and Daniel was holding it in his hands. He had found her through the letters in the box. Her name was Ruth, and she had written 3 separate letters over the course of about 15 years, each one a little more detailed than the last, as if she had spent the years between them gathering the courage to say more. The final letter described a newspaper she had taken from a town library as a young woman, a paper dated decades before the town's official founding, carrying the name of streets she could see from her bedroom window. She had kept it, she wrote, because she understood even then that it was the kind of thing that disappeared if you left it where others could reach it. Ruth had died years before Daniel found the box, but she had a granddaughter named Carol, still living, still sharp, who remembered her grandmother talking about the newspaper the way some families talk about an heirloom. Something important, something that needed to stay in the family. Carol had it in a flat archival sleeve inside a cardboard box in her spare room, and when Daniel explained what he was researching, she drove it to him herself. He put on cotton gloves before he touched it. The paper was fragile in the specific way that very old newsprint gets, not crumbling exactly, but with a brittleness at the edges that made him hold his breath slightly when he unfolded it. The ink had faded to a warm brown, but the date was legible, and the street names in the local notices column were legible, and they matched, exactly and without ambiguity, streets in a town whose official founding had been recorded as taking place more than 2 decades after this paper was printed. Daniel photographed every page. Then he sat back and thought about Ruth as a young woman, walking into a library in a town she had been sent to as a child, finding this paper in a collection of local documents and understanding immediately that something was wrong. Not confused, not misremembering. Understanding. She had been sharp enough to take it, careful enough to keep it, and honest enough to write about it in letters she knew might never be read. He thought about the other letters. He had been treating them as supporting evidence, background texture, the blurry outlines of a larger picture. Now he went back to them with different eyes. He had over 60 letters in total by this point, because after finding the box, he had contacted several regional historical societies and discovered, to his genuine surprise, that similar collections existed in other archives. Uncatalogued, unfiled properly, sitting in miscellaneous boxes the way things sit when nobody knows what category they belong to. He had spent weeks requesting copies, and what came back to him was a pattern so consistent it felt almost methodical. Former ward children writing in their later years, describing the same categories of wrongness. Towns that looked older than they were claimed to be. Structures that showed wear inconsistent with their supposed age. And repeatedly, the experience of asking a question and receiving an answer that did not hold up under the gentlest examination. Workers covering dates on building facades and being told, when asked, that the original dates had been errors. Gravestones in local cemeteries bearing names that did not appear in any official town record from the supposed founding period. Doors in civic buildings that led to stairwells going down, to underground rooms, to tunnels whose existence was never mentioned in any official account of the building's construction. One man named George, who had been sent to a town in a rural inland region as a boy of about 8, wrote that he had found a room beneath the main civic hall entirely by accident, following a cat through a gap in a wall in the building's lower level. The room was large, he wrote, larger than the rooms above it, with a ceiling high enough to stand comfortably, and stone walls that showed the marks of tools he did not recognize. There were objects in the room that he could not identify, and that nobody, when he described them later as an adult, could identify either. When he tried to return to the room as an adult, the gap in the wall had been sealed. When he asked the building's administrator about the lower level, he was told there was no lower level. Daniel read that letter 3 times. Then he pulled his photographs of the engineer's assessments back out and looked at the notation about underground infrastructure. Pre-industrial. Confident. Built by people who expected it to last. The letters were not the confused memories of traumatized children. They were consistent, specific, and corroborated by physical evidence that Daniel could hold in his gloved hands. They were testimonies, and someone had filed them in miscellaneous boxes in the back corners of regional archives, spread across enough separate locations that no single researcher was likely to find more than one collection, spread thin enough that the pattern would only emerge if you gathered them all together. Which is exactly what Daniel had done, and the pattern that emerged was not subtle. The children had been sent to towns that were already old. Towns with underground rooms and covered cornerstones and streets whose names appeared in newspapers printed before the towns were supposed to exist. They had been given new names in some cases, false family histories in others, and they had been placed among new residents who were themselves recent arrivals with no memory of what the town had been before. Everyone in the new town was starting from the same point. Everyone had the same horizon. Nobody remembered further back than the fire, except the buildings did. The buildings remembered everything. And the children, some of them, had been paying attention. Daniel thought about that for a long time. Then he turned to the part of his research he had been saving, the part that had seemed almost too large to approach, the public exhibitions. Because there was one more layer to this, one more mechanism in the system, and it was the most visible one of all. Hidden not in archive boxes or cartographic footnotes, but in plain sight, celebrated in newspapers, attended by millions of people. Grand public exhibitions held in recently burned cities, featuring buildings of impossible scale and complexity, supposedly constructed in months, supposedly temporary, supposedly demolished when the event ended. Daniel spread his exhibition photographs across the table, next to the letters and the atlas pages and Ruth's newspaper. And the thing that struck him first was not the scale of the buildings, it was the style. The same architectural language he had been tracking across burned towns and inherited civic halls appeared again in the exhibition structures. The same proportions, the same relationship between elements. The same confident, unhurried craft that the engineer had called pre-industrial. These were not temporary buildings dressed up to look grand. They were grand buildings dressed up to look temporary. And the story of their demolition was, in several cases, something Daniel could now directly contradict. Both programs ended in the same short window of years, and nobody in the official record ever explained why, because nobody in the official record ever admitted they were connected. Daniel had been tracking the timeline of the transit initiative alongside the fire records for months by this point. He knew the rhythm of the thing. The fires clustering in waves, the child placements following each wave like a tide coming in after a storm, the exhibitions appearing in the burned cities like fresh paint over old damage, the whole system moving with a kind of patient, unhurried coordination that felt less like a series of separate decisions and more like a single long project being executed in stages. And then, within a few years of each other, the fires stopped being catastrophic at scale. The transit initiative quietly wound down. The exhibition ceased. The last ward children were placed. The last grand public showcase closed its gates, and its buildings were absorbed into the civic landscape under new institutional names. Daniel sat with that timeline and felt the shape of it. Not an ending caused by changing times or shifting public attitudes, the way official histories described it. A completion, the kind of stopping that happens when a job is finished, not when it runs out of momentum. He thought about what the job had required. You needed the fires to clear the ground and damage the existing structures enough that their original character could be obscured. You needed the exhibitions to reintroduce those structures to a new public, as fresh achievements, as proof of progress and rebuilding, so that the new population would look at a building with centuries of wear in its bones and see only a proud monument to their own recent history. And you needed the children, young enough to have no prior reference point, raised in these towns, educated in these schools, absorbing the new version of events as naturally as they absorbed language. By the time the last ward child was grown, the new population was complete. Not imported anymore, grown from within. The towns were full of people whose parents and grandparents had arrived with no memory of what came before, and who had raised children with even less reason to ask. The question of what these towns had been before the fires was not suppressed in those later generations. It simply never occurred to them. You cannot miss a story you were never told. That is the part that Daniel found hardest to sit with. Not the scale of the original operation, not even the deliberateness of it, but the elegance of the long game. Whoever designed this understood something fundamental about how history works. It does not live in buildings or in documents. It lives in people. And if you replace the people carefully enough and wait long enough, the buildings and the documents become whatever the new people are told they are. The fires had been the visible part. The children had been the invisible part. And the generation that carried the new story into the future had not been deceived in any way they could have detected, because they were never told there was another version to compare it to. Daniel thought about Harold Prentice giving his speeches about moral duty. He wondered how many of the people involved at every level had understood the full shape of what they were participating in. Some certainly, the ones who sealed boxes and filed letters in miscellaneous categories and kept funding records just opaque enough. But others, probably not. A social worker placing a child with a rural family, believing sincerely in the charity of the work. A local administrator recording a building's founding date without knowing the cornerstone beneath the fresh plaster said something different. A newspaper editor running a story about a world-class exhibition without knowing the buildings he was praising were older than the civilization he thought had built them. The most durable systems are not the ones where everyone knows the plan. They are the ones where most people are doing something that looks entirely reasonable from where they stand, and only the shape visible from very far above reveals what is actually being built. Daniel had that view now. He had not wanted it. He had wanted to find an interesting archival curiosity, write a careful paper, and go back to his quiet basement world of documents and fluorescent light. Instead, he was sitting at a kitchen table covered in photographs and atlas pages and letters written by elderly people who had spent their whole lives sensing that something was wrong and never quite being able to prove it. Ruth had proved it. Her newspaper was sitting in an archival sleeve on the corner of his table, a single piece of printed paper that made the official timeline impossible. She had kept it for decades, passed it to her granddaughter, and her granddaughter had driven it to a researcher she had never met because something in her recognized that the time for keeping it quietly in a box was over. Daniel thought about the person who had assembled the original box of letters. The records administrator who had worked for the Transit Initiative in its final years and had chosen, at some point, not to destroy what he had collected, but to file it, obscurely enough to survive, accessibly enough to be found. Daniel had eventually traced enough about this man to know his name, Thomas, and to know that he had spent the last years of the initiative processing the final placements, signing off on the paperwork that closed the program down. He would have seen the whole shape of it by then. He would have understood what he had been part of, and he had made one small, quiet decision: not to expose it loudly, not to publish or testify or make any dramatic gesture that would have been easy to discredit and easier to suppress. He had simply gathered the letters from people who had noticed things, sealed them in a box, and filed them somewhere a careful person could find them. Daniel looked at the box now, sitting on the shelf above his desk. He had found it by following a filing code that led nowhere. Thomas had known it led nowhere. That was the point. It led nowhere for someone browsing casually, for someone looking specifically, following a thread with patience and enough background knowledge to recognize what they were seeing. It led exactly here. Thomas had not tried to rewrite history. He understood better than anyone how hard that was to do and how easily it could be undone. He had done something smaller and more lasting. He had left a door slightly open, at a height that only someone standing on the right foundation could reach. Daniel had been standing on that foundation without knowing it. Years of archive work, years of learning to read documents the way a doctor reads a face, noticing what is absent as much as what is present. Thomas could not have known Daniel specifically, but he had built the door for someone like him. The letters, the maps, the engineer's assessments, Ruth's newspaper, the exhibition photographs, the fire reports with their careful internal contradictions. None of it was a confession. There was no single document that said plainly what had been done and who had done it. But together, laid out across a kitchen table at 3 in the morning, they formed something that felt more durable than a confession. A shape, a pattern so consistent across so many independent sources that dismissing it required more effort than accepting it. History, Daniel had always believed, was not a story told once and finished. It was a negotiation between what happened and what people were willing to remember. For a long time, the negotiation around these towns and these children and these fires had been entirely one-sided because only one side had been in the room. He picked up Thomas's box and held it for a moment. It was lighter than it looked. He thought about all the people who had carried something heavy for a long time because they had no one to hand it to. Ruth with her newspaper, George with his memory of a sealed underground room, the dozens of others who had written their careful, quiet letters and sent them into an archive and never known whether anyone would read them. Someone had read them. And the question that stays with me, the one I cannot stop thinking about, is this. If the people who built this system understood that the most powerful thing you can take from someone is not their home or their name, but their version of the past, what does that tell us about every official history we have ever been handed and never thought to question? What story have you been living inside without knowing it was written by someone else? If this investigation made you think, if it made you uncomfortable, if it made you want to go back and look at something you always assumed was settled, then you already understand why this kind of work matters. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I want to know what you make of all this. And if you want to follow where this research goes next, subscribe and leave a like. It is the simplest way to make sure none of this stays buried.